The denim jacket slipped from Daniel O'Sullivan's trembling hands as the elderly homeless woman took her final breath on the emergency room floor. Her last words echoed in the sterile air. "Tell Catherine. Ruth knows the truth." Danny had never heard those names before in his life. The cardiac monitor's flat-line scream pierced the 3 a.m. silence as nurses rushed past him, their shoes squeaking against blood-stained linoleum. A security guard dropped his coffee, the ceramic mug shattering into pieces that scattered like broken promises across the hospital corridor. 4 years ago, Danny had been the orthopedic surgeon trying to save lives in this very hospital. Tonight he was just another homeless man who'd carried in a dying stranger from the parking lot, where he now slept in his rusted Honda Civic. "Get him out of here," the attending physician barked, not recognizing the broken man who once worked beside him. But as Danny clutched the woman's final possession, a faded photograph of a young girl in a school uniform, one question burned through his exhausted mind. Who was Catherine? And why did a dying woman's last breath carry the weight of a secret that would soon destroy everything he thought he knew about redemption? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The photograph haunted Danny through the sleepless hours that followed. Back in his Honda Civic parked behind Philadelphia General Hospital, where security guards knew him well enough to look the other way, he studied the image under the dome light. A girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a Catholic school uniform and clutching a stuffed rabbit. On the back, someone had written in fading ink, "Sophie Henderson, age 8, gone but never forgotten." Danny's hands shook as he recognized the writing. It matched the prescription pads he'd once used, the careful loops and precise letters of a medical professional. But he'd never written those words, never known a Sophie Henderson. The mystery gnawed at him like the chronic pain in his arthritic fingers, a cruel reminder of the surgeon he used to be. 4 years ago, Dr. Daniel O'Sullivan had owned a colonial house in Chestnut Hill, complete with a 3-car garage and a medical practice that netted him 6 figures annually. His wife, Sarah, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, her laughter filling their kitchen every morning as she graded papers over coffee. Their son, Mickey, played varsity baseball and talked about following his father into medicine. The malpractice lawsuit changed everything. Sarah's lupus symptoms, joint pain, fatigue, the telltale butterfly rash across her cheeks, had been dismissed by Danny as stress from her demanding job. By the time the correct diagnosis came, the disease had ravaged her kidneys beyond repair. She died 18 months later, drowning in her own fluid while Danny held her hand and whispered apologies she could no longer hear. The medical board suspended his license pending investigation. The house went into foreclosure to pay legal fees. Mickey, barely 15 and raw with grief, chose to live with Sarah's parents rather than watch his father's daily disintegration. The final blow came when Danny discovered Sarah's medical bills had consumed their life insurance policy, leaving him with nothing but debt and the weight of knowing his professional arrogance had killed the woman he loved. Now, 3 years into homelessness, Danny survived on odd jobs and the kindness of other lost souls. He'd kept his old medical bag, using it to help fellow homeless when they couldn't afford emergency rooms. Street medicine, they called it, treating infections with expired antibiotics, setting bones with makeshift splints, talking suicidal veterans down from bridge railings. The dying woman had appeared outside the hospital around midnight, collapsed near the ambulance bay. Danny had carried her inside, staying with her when the overworked staff assumed he was family. Her final words felt like a message meant for someone else, delivered to the wrong recipient by a universe with a twisted sense of humor. As dawn broke over Philadelphia's skyline, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Danny made a decision that would change everything. He would find this Catherine, deliver the photograph, and fulfill a dying woman's final wish. He had failed Sarah when she needed him most, but maybe he could succeed where it mattered to someone else. He had no idea that his search would lead him to the woman who would either destroy him completely or teach him that redemption sometimes wore the face of unexpected love. The SEPTA bus stop on South Broad Street buzzed with evening rush hour chaos, but Catherine Morrison sat apart from the crowd, her navy blazer clinging uncomfortably to her skin despite September's unusual chill. Her Tesla had broken down 6 blocks from Morrison Construction's headquarters, its climate control system failing spectacularly on the day she needed confidence most. The board meeting in 20 minutes would determine whether she kept control of the company her father had built or whether the vultures circling since his death would finally feast. Catherine pressed her phone against her ear, listening to her assistant's increasingly frantic updates. "The Henderson Project investors are already in the conference room," Rachel said. "And your brother Bobby's been asking where you are." Of course Bobby was stirring trouble. Her younger brother had never forgiven her for inheriting their father's construction empire while he'd been relegated to CFO. The fact that she'd actually grown the company by 30% in 2 years meant nothing to someone who believed birthright trumped competence. "Tell them I'm 5 minutes away," Catherine lied, watching the 23 bus lumber through traffic that moved like congealed cement. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cool air, but from the Adderall she'd been taking to keep up with 18-hour workdays. The pills helped her focus, but they also made temperature regulation nearly impossible. A man approached the bus stop, his worn work boots shuffling against cracked pavement. Catherine instinctively shifted away, her designer purse clutched tighter against her side. She'd learned to be wary of strangers, especially ones whose clothes suggested they lived on society's margins. But this man didn't ask for money or attention. Instead, he stood quietly at the far end of the shelter, studying a folded photograph with intense concentration. Something about his posture caught her attention. Despite his obviously second-hand clothes and the hollow look of someone who'd missed too many meals, he carried himself with dignity. His salt and pepper hair was clean and recently cut, suggesting he cared about appearance even when circumstances made it difficult. Most striking were his hands, surgeon's hands, she realized with surprise. Long fingers, careful movements, the kind of precision that came from years of delicate work. The evening air grew cooler, and Catherine's trembling intensified. The Adderall crash was hitting harder than usual, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. She'd been taking the pills for 6 months now, ever since she'd started skimming money from her grandmother Ruth's care facility account to cover the company's cash flow problems. The guilt required chemical assistance to manage. The man noticed her distress. Without a word, he approached and gently draped his denim jacket over her shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so purely kind, that Catherine felt tears threaten for the first time in months. "You don't have to," she began. "My wife used to get cold like that," he said quietly, "when her blood pressure dropped. The shaking, the pale skin. You should probably see a doctor." Catherine looked into his eyes and saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of someone struggling. This stranger had identified her distress more accurately than any of her business associates, who assumed her success meant she had everything under control. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Danny?" "Catherine." She pulled his jacket closer, surprised by how much warmer she felt. The fabric smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something else. Hope, maybe, or the kind of stubborn optimism that survived despite evidence to the contrary. "You mentioned your wife," Catherine said. "Is she?" "Gone." 3 years now." Danny's expression clouded briefly before returning to neutral. "Lupus. I should have caught it earlier, but I was too busy being important to pay attention to what mattered." The 23 bus finally arrived, belching diesel fumes, and the promise of escape from this increasingly complicated encounter. Catherine stood, then hesitated. Danny made no move to reclaim his jacket. "Keep it," he said when she started to remove it. "Looks like you need it more than I do tonight." Catherine reached into her purse and extracted a business card. "In case you ever need anything," she said, pressing it into his calloused palm. The contact felt electric, charged with possibilities neither of them understood. As the bus pulled away, Catherine watched Danny grow smaller through the rear window. He stood alone under the flickering streetlight, his shoulders squared against the evening chill, still holding her business card. She didn't know then that he was homeless, didn't know about his medical license or his dead wife or the son who refused to speak to him. She only knew that a stranger had offered kindness without expecting anything in return, and that simple act had cracked something open inside her chest. The jacket smelled like hope, and Catherine Morrison hadn't felt hopeful in a very long time. Catherine's fingers traced the jacket's worn seams as she sat in her penthouse apartment that night, the city lights of Philadelphia sparkling beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. The board meeting had gone better than expected. The Henderson Community Center project was approved, funding secured for the ambitious renovation that would transform an abandoned Catholic school into a state-of-the-art facility for underserved families. But her mind kept returning to the man at the bus stop, to the gentleness in his voice when he'd mentioned his wife. She reached into the jacket's inner pocket, searching for tissues, and her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a folded piece of paper, soft with age and handling. Catherine unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten letter in shaky, elderly script. "My dearest Sophie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to tell you what I should have said when you were alive. I failed you, sweetheart. I failed your daddy David and your mama Maria, too. I knew about the drinking, knew Bobby Morrison was dangerous behind the wheel, but I said nothing because I was afraid of causing trouble for a wealthy family." Catherine's blood turned to ice. Morrison, her family name, her brother Bobby. I was Ruth Walsh then, working as a housekeeper for the Morrison family. I saw young Bobby come home drunk so many times, heard the crashes in the driveway, watched him stumble up the stairs while his parents made excuses. I should have called someone, should have reported him, but I needed the job. Your great-aunt Ruth was a coward baby girl, and my silence cost you your beautiful life. The letter slipped from Catherine's trembling hands. Ruth Walsh, her grandmother Ruth, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when Catherine was 12. Ruth, who had Alzheimer's and lived in an expensive memory care facility that Catherine could barely afford. Ruth, who apparently had a secret that connected her to a tragedy Catherine's brother had caused. She grabbed her laptop with shaking fingers, searching online archives for Morrison family accidents. The articles loaded slowly, each headline hitting her like a physical blow. 3 dead in Center City collision. Drunk driver flees scene. Henderson family killed by hit-and-run driver. The photos showed a mangled sedan, emergency responders working frantically, and then the victims. David Henderson, 34, a social worker. Maria Henderson, 32, a nurse, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, who loved rabbits and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. The same Sophie from the photograph Danny had been studying at the bus stop. Catherine's phone rang. Bobby's name flashed on the screen. "Cat, we need to talk." Her brother's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Someone's been asking questions about the Henderson case." Some homeless guy was showing Sophie's picture around the hospital today. "What homeless guy?" Catherine's voice came out as a whisper. "How should I know? The point is, if this gets out now, it'll destroy everything. The company, our reputation, the Henderson Center project. Ironic, isn't it? Building a memorial to the family I killed, Catherine felt bile rise in her throat. You killed them? Christ, Cat, you knew. You had to know. Why do you think I've been so paranoid about that project? Why do you think I insisted we name it after them? Bobby's voice cracked. I've been living with this for 4 years. Every day, wondering when someone would connect the dots. I didn't know, Catherine whispered. I swear I didn't know. Well, now you do. And if you want to keep our family out of prison, you'll help me figure out how to handle this homeless guy before he goes to the police. Catherine ended the call and stared at the jacket draped across her lap. Daniel, the kind stranger who'd given her his coat, was somehow connected to the Henderson family. Was he investigating Bobby? Was their meeting really a coincidence? Or had he sought her out deliberately? She thought about his surgeon's hands, his mention of failing his wife, the careful way he'd studied that photograph. What if Daniel wasn't just a random homeless man? What if he was someone with the skills and motivation to uncover the truth about her family's darkest secret? The business card she'd given him was still missing from her purse. By now he would know exactly who she was, would have researched Morrison Construction and discovered the Henderson Center project. The irony would be unmistakable. The sister of a killer building a memorial to his victims, funded by money stolen from the woman who could have prevented their deaths. Catherine walked to her bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet, staring at the bottle of Adderall that had become her crutch. She'd started taking the pills 6 months ago when the stress of running the company and managing Ruth's care had become overwhelming. But the real reason she needed chemical help to function was the guilt of stealing from her grandmother's account. 50,000 here, 30,000 there, always with the justification that she was borrowing from Ruth's future to pay for Ruth's present. Now she understood that Ruth's money was blood money, earned through decades of silence about a crime that cost 3 innocent lives. And Catherine had been using that tainted wealth to build a monument to her brother's victims, creating a grotesque cycle of guilt and irony that seemed designed by a cruel universe. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I have something that belongs to your grandmother. We need to meet. Daniel O'Sullivan. Catherine's hands shook as she typed back. How did you get this number? Your business card. I know about Ruth and the Henderson family. We need to talk before this gets worse. The response came immediately. Tomorrow, Morrison Construction Lobby, noon. Come alone and bring the truth. Catherine set down the phone and pulled Danny's jacket tighter around her shoulders. In 12 hours, she would face the man whose kindness had accidentally exposed her family's sins. She had no idea whether he was her salvation or her destruction, but she knew her life would never be the same. Outside her penthouse windows, Philadelphia slept uneasily, and somewhere in the darkness the past was finally catching up to the present. The Morrison Construction Lobby felt like a cathedral of glass and steel, its soaring ceilings and marble floors designed to intimidate. Catherine stood near the reception desk at exactly noon, Danny's jacket folded carefully over her arm, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd barely slept, spending the night researching Daniel O'Sullivan and discovering a story that broke her heart even as it terrified her. Dr. Daniel O'Sullivan, former chief of orthopedic surgery at Philadelphia General, medical license suspended following a malpractice lawsuit, wife deceased from complications of lupus, son estranged, current address, none listed. The pieces painted a picture of a man who'd lost everything, just as she was about to lose everything herself. Danny entered through the revolving doors at 12:03, and Catherine was struck again by the dignity he maintained despite his circumstances. He wore the same second-hand clothes from the night before, but his hair was freshly combed and his face clean-shaven. In his hand, he carried a manila folder that seemed to contain her fate. "Ms. Morrison," he said formally, approaching with measured steps. The security guard watched them with curious eyes, clearly wondering why the company CEO was meeting with someone who looked homeless. "Please, call me Catherine, and thank you for coming." She held out his jacket. "I believe this belongs to you." Danny took the jacket but didn't put it on. Instead, he gestured toward the seating area near the windows. "We should sit. This conversation might take a while." As they settled into leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, Danny opened the folder and withdrew the photograph Catherine had found in his jacket pocket. Sophie Henderson's innocent face smiled up at them, frozen in time and ignorance of the tragedy that awaited her. "I found this on a dying woman 3 nights ago," Danny began. Her last words were, "Tell Catherine, Ruth knows the truth. I've been trying to piece together what that means." Catherine's throat felt like sandpaper. "What else did you find?" Danny's expression hardened slightly. "Enough to know that your brother Robert Morrison was driving the car that killed the Henderson family 4 years ago. Enough to know that your grandmother Ruth was working for your family at the time and might have information that could have prevented their deaths." The words hung between them like a loaded gun. Catherine felt the familiar urge to reach for her Adderall, to numb the crushing weight of this moment, but she forced herself to stay present. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, "about Ruth, about the money, about why this is more complicated than you know." Danny leaned forward, his surgeon's focus entirely on her face. Catherine found his attention both comforting and unnerving. "Ruth has Alzheimer's," Catherine began. "She's in a memory care facility that costs $8,000 a month. The company's cash flow has been challenging since my father died. I've been taking money from Ruth's personal account to cover her expenses." "Taking money?" Danny's voice remained neutral, but she saw judgment flicker in his eyes. "Stealing," Catherine corrected herself. "I've stolen over $300,000 from my grandmother's savings. I told myself it was temporary, that I was borrowing to ensure her care, but the truth is I'm a thief who's been robbing an elderly woman with dementia." Danny was quiet for a long moment, processing this admission. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to find out anyway." "Because I think you deserve to know who you're dealing with before you decide what to do with the information about my brother." "And what do you think I should do?" Catherine looked out at the city where 3 innocent people had died because of her family's sins. "I think you should go to the police. I think you should expose Bobby and let justice finally be served. The Henderson family deserves that much. Even if it destroys you? Especially if it destroys me." Catherine's voice broke slightly. "Those people died because my family prioritized our reputation over public safety. Ruth knew Bobby was dangerous and said nothing. I've built my success on money stolen from an old woman who can't defend herself. Maybe destruction is what we deserve." Danny studied her with the intensity of someone who'd spent years reading X-rays and CAT scans, looking for hidden problems beneath the surface. "There's something else, isn't there?" "Something you're not telling me." Catherine felt tears threaten. How could this homeless stranger see through her so easily when her own board of directors, her own brother, never noticed her struggles? "I think I'm in love with you," she whispered. "Which is insane because I barely know you, but giving me your jacket was the first genuine kindness I've experienced in years. And now I find out you're connected to the worst thing my family has ever done, and I can't tell if you meeting me was fate or coincidence or some kind of cosmic joke." Danny's expression softened. "Catherine, Ms. Morrison." A voice interrupted them. Catherine looked up to see her assistant Rachel approaching, her face pale with anxiety. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but your brother is looking for you. He seems agitated." As if summoned by her words, Bobby Morrison strode across the lobby, his usual charm replaced by barely controlled fury. He spotted Danny immediately, his eyes narrowing with recognition. You, Bobby said, stopping in front of their seating area. You're the one who's been asking questions about the Henderson case. Danny stood slowly, and Catherine was surprised to see he was taller than her brother. Robert Morrison, I presume? It's Bobby, and I think you have something that belongs to my family. You mean this? Danny held up Sophie Henderson's photograph. I found it on a dying woman who wanted me to deliver a message to Catherine. Would you like to know what she said? Bobby's face went white. I don't know what game you're playing, but she said Ruth knows the truth, Danny continued calmly. About a little girl named Sophie, about her parents, David and Maria, about the drunk driver who killed them and drove away. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you were drunk. I know you ran a red light. I know you left 3 people dying in the street while you drove home to Mommy and Daddy. Danny's voice remained steady, but Catherine could see the controlled rage in his posture. What I don't know is how you've lived with yourself for 4 years. Bobby took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists. You have no proof, no witnesses, just the ramblings of some crazy homeless woman. Actually, Danny said, I have more than that. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a second folder, this one containing what looked like medical records. I've been researching the Henderson case for 3 days now. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look and have medical training to interpret the evidence. Catherine felt the world tilt around her. Danny, what are you saying? I'm saying that Maria Henderson didn't die instantly in the crash. She lived for 6 hours at Philadelphia General Hospital, conscious for most of that time. She gave a detailed description of the driver who hit them to 3 different nurses, a description that matches your brother perfectly. Bobby's face had gone from white to green. That's impossible. I was told they all died at the scene. You were lied to, Danny said simply. Probably by the same people who helped cover up your crime. But Maria Henderson's testimony is in her medical file, and I have copies. Catherine stared at Danny with a mixture of admiration and horror. You're not homeless, are you? You're not just some random man who gave me your jacket. Danny's expression grew complicated. I am homeless, Catherine. I did lose everything, but I'm also a doctor who knows how to research medical cases, and I've been investigating the Henderson murders for my own reasons. What reasons? Danny was quiet for a long moment, then said, because Maria Henderson's lupus was misdiagnosed by her primary care physician. The stress of that misdiagnosis weakened her immune system and made her more vulnerable to the injuries from the crash. Her doctor dismissed her symptoms as anxiety and depression. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. Danny, I was her doctor, he said quietly. I failed to properly diagnose her lupus, just like I failed my own wife. Maria Henderson died partly because of your brother's drunk driving and partly because of my medical negligence. The revelation hit the lobby like a bomb going off. Bobby staggered backward, Catherine gasped audibly, and Rachel dropped the files she'd been carrying, papers scattering across the marble floor. Jesus Christ, Bobby whispered. You're both guilty. Danny nodded slowly. Which is why this is so complicated. I can expose your brother's crime, Catherine, but doing so will also expose my own malpractice. I'll face criminal charges for medical negligence resulting in death. My son will discover that his father is not just a failure but a killer. Catherine felt the room spinning around her. The man she was falling in love with was connected to her family's tragedy in ways that seemed impossible, ways that made any future between them a grotesque mockery of justice. What do you want? Bobby asked, his voice barely audible. I want the truth, Danny said. All of it. I want Maria Henderson's family to know what really happened to her. I want Sophie's memory to be honored properly. And I want us all to face the consequences of our actions. Even if it destroys everything? Catherine whispered. Danny looked at her with infinite sadness. Especially then, because the alternative is living with lies for the rest of our lives, and I can't do that anymore." In the silence that followed, Catherine realized that her choice wasn't between love and justice, success and failure, or even right and wrong. Her choice was between the comfortable prison of secrets and the terrifying freedom of truth. And for the first time in years, she knew exactly what she had to do. The Henderson Community Center's grand opening ceremony was supposed to be Catherine's triumph. Instead, it felt like a funeral for everything she'd believed about herself and her family. The converted Catholic school buzzed with activity as local politicians, community leaders, and media representatives gathered to celebrate the renovation that had transformed a crumbling building into a beacon of hope for Philadelphia's underserved families. Catherine stood at the podium in the main gymnasium, looking out at faces that had no idea they were witnessing the calm before a devastating storm. The past 3 weeks had been a careful choreography of investigation and revelation as Danny worked with FBI investigators to build an airtight case against both Bobby and himself. Today's ceremony would serve as the platform for the most public confession in Philadelphia's recent memory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "we gather today to celebrate more than just a building renovation. We gather to honor the memory of 3 beautiful souls whose lives were cut short by preventable tragedy." She gestured to the memorial wall where David, Maria, and Sophie Henderson's photographs were displayed alongside dozens of flowers and handwritten notes from community members. David Henderson was a social worker who dedicated his life to helping homeless veterans find housing and mental health services. Maria Henderson was a pediatric nurse who volunteered at free clinics in her spare time. And Sophie Henderson was an 8-year-old girl who wanted to be a veterinarian so she could help sick animals. The audience murmured appreciatively, unaware that the woman speaking had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund this very project. Catherine spotted Danny in the crowd, standing near the back with Mickey O'Sullivan, the 18-year-old son who had finally agreed to hear his father's story. Beside them stood Frank Rodriguez, a grizzled Vietnam veteran whose weathered face carried the weight of unimaginable loss. Frank was David Henderson's father, and his presence today was both a blessing and a reckoning. "What happened to the Henderson family," Catherine continued, "was not just a random accident. It was the result of choices made by people who prioritized their own comfort over public safety, who chose silence over courage, who valued reputation over human life." Bobby Morrison sat in the front row, his face ashen and his hands trembling visibly. He'd fought against this public confession until the very end, threatening legal action and family loyalty in equal measure. But Catherine had made her choice 3 weeks ago in the Morrison construction lobby, and nothing he said could change her mind now. Behind Bobby sat Ruth Walsh in her wheelchair, brought from the memory care facility for this special occasion. At 78, Ruth's Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she rarely recognized anyone. But today she seemed unusually alert, her faded blue eyes tracking Catherine's movements with sharp intelligence. Catherine had discovered that Ruth's lucid moments often coincided with high-stress situations, as if crisis temporarily burned through the fog of dementia. 4 years ago, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger, my brother Robert Morrison was driving under the influence when he ran a red light at the intersection of Broad and South Street. His vehicle struck the Henderson family's car at 60 miles per hour, killing all 3 passengers. Gasps rippled through the audience. Several reporters immediately began typing on their phones and laptops. Catherine saw shock and confusion on dozens of faces as people struggled to process what they were hearing. Then Robert fled the scene, Catherine continued relentlessly. He left David, Maria, and Sophie Henderson dying in the street while he drove home to avoid responsibility for his actions. Our family then engaged in a systematic cover-up that lasted 4 years, using our wealth and connections to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. Bobby stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the gymnasium floor. "Catherine, stop. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Catherine replied without missing a beat. "I'm telling the truth for the first time in my adult life." Bobby looked around desperately, then made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of storming out or continuing to deny the allegations, he walked to the podium and gently moved Catherine aside. "She's right," he said into the microphone, his voice cracking with emotion. "I killed the Henderson family. I was drunk, I was driving recklessly, and when I realized what I'd done, I panicked and drove away." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children playing in the adjacent rooms seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their laughter and shouts fading to nothing. "I've been living with this guilt for 4 years," Bobby continued, tears streaming down his face. "Every morning I wake up knowing that 3 innocent people are dead because of my selfishness. Every night I go to sleep seeing Sophie Henderson's face in my dreams." Frank Rodriguez stood up slowly, his weathered hands gripping the back of his chair for support. At 82, the Vietnam veteran had survived jungle warfare, Agent Orange exposure, and 30 years of homelessness after returning from Southeast Asia, but nothing had prepared him for losing his only son and granddaughter to a drunk driver. "You killed my boy," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd stared death in the face too many times to be intimidated by wealth or power. "David was going to be a doctor. Did you know that? He was saving money for medical school while he worked with homeless vets like me." Bobby nodded miserably. "I know. I've read about him, about all of them. I know what I took from the world." "And what about my granddaughter?" Frank's voice grew harder. "Sophie was the light of my life. She used to visit me at the VA hospital, bringing drawings she'd made in school. She wanted to help sick animals because she said they couldn't ask for help themselves." The gymnasium had become a cathedral of grief, every person present witnessing a reconciliation between victim and perpetrator that should have happened 4 years earlier. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Bobby face the consequences of his actions with a courage he'd never shown before. But the confessions weren't finished. Danny stepped forward from the back of the room, Mickey following close behind. Catherine's heart clenched as she saw the love and support in Mickey's eyes, the 18-year-old finally understanding why his father had destroyed himself with guilt. "There's something else," Danny announced, his voice carrying the authority of his medical training. "Something that makes this tragedy even more complex." He approached the podium, and Catherine saw him steel himself for what came next. "I was Maria Henderson's primary care physician," Danny said. "In the months before her death, she came to me repeatedly, complaining of joint pain, fatigue, and skin rashes. I dismissed her symptoms as stress and anxiety, failing to order the blood tests that would have diagnosed her lupus." The audience stirred restlessly, confused by this additional revelation. Frank Rodriguez's face had gone completely white. "If I had properly diagnosed Maria's lupus," Danny continued, "she would have been on immunosuppressive medications that might have helped her survive the crash injuries. My medical negligence contributed to her death just as surely as Robert Morrison's drunk driving." Frank sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the realization that his daughter-in-law had been failed by multiple systems designed to protect her. "My own wife died from lupus complications," Danny said, his voice breaking. "I failed to diagnose her properly, too, dismissing her symptoms until it was too late. I lost my medical license, my home, my family. I've been homeless for 3 years, carrying the guilt of knowing that my professional arrogance has killed 2 women I was supposed to help." Catherine watched Mickey O'Sullivan step up beside his father, placing a supportive hand on Danny's shoulder. The gesture spoke volumes about forgiveness and the possibility of redemption through truth-telling. "Why are you telling us this?" asked a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Danny looked directly at Catherine, then at Frank Rodriguez, then at Bobby Morrison. Because secrets are poison. Because the Henderson family deserves to know the complete truth about what happened to them. And because I believe that facing our failures honestly is the only way to honor the people we've lost. Ruth Walsh suddenly spoke from her wheelchair, her voice cutting through the emotional chaos with startling clarity. "I knew," she said simply. "I knew Bobby was drinking and driving. I knew Maria wasn't getting proper medical care. I worked for the Morrison family and I said nothing because I was afraid of losing my job." The gymnasium erupted in murmurs and whispers as people struggled to process the scope of the systemic failure that had led to the Henderson family's deaths. Catherine realized that her grandmother's confession completed the circle of accountability, revealing how economic desperation had silenced the one person who might have prevented the tragedy. As camera flashes illuminated the gymnasium and reporters frantically scribbled notes, Catherine felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The truth was finally free, and whatever came next, criminal charges, financial ruin, public disgrace, at least she would face it honestly. But she had no idea that the worst revelations were still to come. The FBI raid on Morrison Construction came at dawn, 3 days after the Henderson Center confession. Catherine sat in her penthouse apartment, still wearing yesterday's clothes, watching news helicopters circle the building that had been her father's legacy and her life's work. The morning light cast long shadows across Philadelphia's skyline, but she felt nothing except the hollow numbness that comes after losing everything you thought mattered. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, board members, former friends suddenly eager to distance themselves from the Morrison family scandal. She'd stopped answering after the 5th call from her lawyer, who kept repeating variations of "How could you be so stupid?" as if she hadn't asked herself that question 1,000 times already. The charges were devastating. Federal investigators had uncovered not just the Henderson cover-up and Catherine's embezzlement from Ruth's account, but a web of construction fraud dating back to her father's era. Bribes to city inspectors, substandard materials in low-income housing projects, safety violations that had resulted in worker injuries. The Morrison empire had been built on a foundation of corruption that made Catherine's recent crimes seem almost quaint by comparison. Bobby sat across from her at the kitchen table, his face gaunt from 3 sleepless nights. He'd aged a decade in 72 hours, his golden boy looks replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd finally run out of places to hide. "The lawyers say I'm looking at 25 to life," he said quietly, staring at his untouched coffee. "Vehicular homicide, leaving the scene, conspiracy to obstruct justice. They're throwing everything at me." Catherine nodded absently. Her own legal situation was only slightly better. 5 to 10 years for elder abuse and embezzlement, plus civil lawsuits from Ruth's estate and the families of people injured in Morrison construction projects. The company was already in bankruptcy proceedings, its assets frozen pending criminal investigations. "I keep thinking about that little girl," Bobby continued. "Sophie. She'd be 12 now if I hadn't—" His voice broke completely. Catherine reached across the table and took her brother's hand. Despite everything, the lies, the cover-ups, the years of enabling his destructive behavior, he was still family. Still the scared little boy who'd crawled into her bed during thunderstorms when they were children. "Maybe this is better," she said. "Maybe living with the truth is better than dying with lies." Before Bobby could respond, the apartment door burst open. Federal agents in tactical gear swarmed through the entrance, weapons drawn, shouting commands that seemed to come from underwater. Catherine raised her hand slowly, watching her brother do the same, both of them moving with the strange calm of people who'd been expecting this moment. "Catherine Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering," the lead agent announced, producing handcuffs that gleamed under the kitchen lights. "Robert Morrison, you're under arrest for vehicular homicide, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and racketeering." As the cold metal clicked around her wrists, Catherine thought about Danny O'Sullivan, who was facing his own arrest warrant for medical malpractice resulting in death. The man she'd fallen in love with was as guilty as she was. Their mutual attraction built on a foundation of shared culpability that made any future between them impossible. The perp walk through the Morrison construction lobby was a media circus. Photographers and camera crews lined the sidewalks, shouting questions that Catherine couldn't hear over the roar of blood in her ears. She kept her head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about her father spinning in his grave or her grandmother Ruth watching this humiliation on television from her memory care facility. The Philadelphia County Jail was everything Catherine had expected and worse. Concrete walls that wept with condensation, the smell of industrial disinfectant failing to mask deeper odors of human desperation, the constant noise of slamming doors and shouted conversations echoing through corridors that seemed designed to crush hope. Her cellmate was a 19-year-old named Jasmine who'd been arrested for check fraud, a crime that seemed almost innocent compared to Catherine's charges. Jasmine had 3 young children and no family support, circumstances that made Catherine's privileged background feel like an additional source of shame. "You're that construction lady," Jasmine said on Catherine's second night, studying her with curious eyes. "The one who stole from her grandmother." Catherine nodded, too exhausted to deny or explain. "My grandmother raised me too," Jasmine continued. "After my mom got hooked on crack and my dad disappeared, Grandma worked 3 jobs to keep us fed, never took a dime she didn't earn honest." She paused. "I can't imagine stealing from her, no matter how desperate I got." The judgment was quiet but devastating. Catherine had told herself for months that she was borrowing from Ruth to ensure her grandmother's care. But the truth was simpler and uglier. She'd stolen from a vulnerable elderly woman because it was easier than facing her company's financial problems honestly. On her 3rd day in jail, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Frank Rodriguez sat across from her in the visiting room, his weathered hands folded carefully on the metal table between them. The Vietnam veteran looked tired but determined, his eyes holding none of the rage she'd expected. "I wanted to see you," Frank said simply, "to understand why." Catherine felt tears threaten for the first time since her arrest. "I don't have a good answer. I was scared, overwhelmed, making terrible decisions to cover up other terrible decisions." "Your brother killed my family," Frank said. "You helped him hide it. Your doctor friend failed my daughter-in-law. Your grandmother knew Bobby was dangerous and said nothing." He leaned forward slightly. "But you know what the worst part is?" Catherine shook her head. "The worst part is that if just one of you had done the right thing at any point in the last 4 years, this conversation wouldn't be happening. If Bobby had stayed at the scene and called for help, Maria might have survived with proper emergency treatment. If Dr. O'Sullivan had correctly diagnosed her lupus, she would have been stronger and better able to handle the trauma. If your grandmother had reported Bobby's drinking, he might have gotten help before he killed anyone. If you had gone to the police instead of covering up the crime, my family would have had justice and closure." Each word was a hammer blow to Catherine's already shattered sense of self. Frank Rodriguez wasn't wrong. Every adult connected to this tragedy had chosen self-preservation over doing what was right. "Why are you here?" Catherine asked. "Why aren't you screaming at me or demanding revenge?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. "Because I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same place, rock bottom, facing consequences for choices that seemed reasonable at the time." He paused. "After I came back from Vietnam, I spent 15 years drinking myself to death. Did things I'm not proud of hurt people who didn't deserve it. The only reason I survived was because someone believed I could be better than my worst mistakes. What are you saying? I'm saying that hating you won't bring back David and Maria and Sophie. I'm saying that maybe the best way to honor their memory is to make sure their deaths lead to something good, something that prevents other families from going through what we've all been through. Catherine stared at the old veteran, struggling to understand how someone who'd lost so much could offer forgiveness to the people responsible for his pain. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she said quietly. "None of us deserve forgiveness," Frank replied. "That's what makes it grace." As visiting hours ended and guards prepared to escort Catherine back to her cell, Frank stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Your grandmother Ruth is dying," he said. "Hospice care. Maybe a week or two left. She's been asking for you." The news hit Catherine like a physical blow. Ruth was the only family she had left besides Bobby, the woman who'd raised her and loved her despite Catherine's betrayals. The thought of her grandmother dying alone while Catherine sat in jail was unbearable. "I can't get out to see her," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "Maybe not," Frank agreed. "But she knows you loved her, even when you lost your way. Sometimes that has to be enough." As Catherine was led back to her cell, she realized that losing everything, her company, her freedom, her future, was nothing compared to losing the chance to say goodbye to the woman who'd taught her what love looked like. But in the darkness of her cell that night, surrounded by the sounds of other broken lives, Catherine began to understand that hitting rock bottom wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of learning how to build something real from the ruins of everything she'd destroyed. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on Catherine's fifth day in Philadelphia County Jail. A corrections officer shook her awake, his voice gentle in a way that immediately told her something was terribly wrong. "Morrison, you have a call. It's about your grandmother." Catherine's hands trembled as she picked up the phone in the empty visiting room. Ruth's hospice nurse spoke in the soft, practiced tones of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Miss Morrison, I'm calling because your grandmother specifically asked for you. She's in her final hours, and she's been remarkably lucid for the past day. She says she has something important to tell you before she passes." "I can't leave," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm in jail awaiting trial. They won't let me out for a visit. Actually, they will. Your lawyer filed an emergency compassionate release petition this afternoon. It was approved for 4 hours under guard supervision. A deputy is already on his way." The ride to Philadelphia General Hospital felt like a journey through purgatory. Handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, watching the city she'd grown up in pass by behind bulletproof glass, Catherine realized she was seeing her world for the last time as a free woman. When her trial concluded, she would likely spend the next decade in federal prison, emerging as a middle-aged ex-convict with no family, no money, and no prospects. The hospital's hospice wing was quieter than the main floors, painted in soothing colors that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of disinfectant and approaching death. Catherine's escort, Deputy Martinez, was surprisingly kind, allowing her to walk without restraints once they reached Ruth's room. Ruth lay in the narrow hospital bed, her once sturdy frame reduced to bird-like fragility. At 78, she'd always seemed indestructible to Catherine, the tough Irish woman who'd worked 3 jobs to support her family, who'd raised an orphaned granddaughter with more love than most parents gave their biological children. Now she looked ancient and translucent, as if a strong wind might carry her away. But her eyes were sharp and focused in a way Catherine hadn't seen for months. "Kathy," Ruth whispered, using the childhood nickname that no one else was allowed to say. "Come here, darling." Catherine approached the bed slowly, afraid that moving too quickly might shatter this fragile moment of clarity. She took her grandmother's hand, surprised by how cold and papery the skin felt. "I'm so sorry, Nana," Catherine began, but Ruth squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Stop," Ruth said firmly. "I don't have time for apologies. I have things to tell you, and you need to listen carefully because I won't be here much longer to explain." Catherine nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "The money you took from my account," Ruth continued. "I knew about every penny. I've known for 6 months." Catherine's blood turned to ice. "What?" "Alzheimer's doesn't take everything at once, sweetheart. It comes and goes like fog. I have clear days, confused days, and completely lost days. On my clear days, I check my bank statements online. I know exactly how much you've taken and when." The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you say anything?" Ruth's eyes grew sad but understanding. "Because you were desperate and I failed you. Just like I failed the Henderson family." Catherine felt the room spinning around her. "Nana, what are you talking about?" Ruth struggled to sit up slightly, her breathing labored but determined. "I need to tell you about David Henderson's father, about Frank Rodriguez. I know Frank. He came to see me in jail. He's a Vietnam veteran who—" "He's my son," Ruth interrupted quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Catherine stared at her grandmother, certain she'd misheard. "That's impossible. Frank's last name is Rodriguez. He's Hispanic. You said your son died in Vietnam." "Frank Rodriguez was born Francis Walsh," Ruth explained patiently. "My boy. I gave him up for adoption when I was 16 because I couldn't provide for him. The Rodriguez family raised him, loved him, gave him their name. He enlisted in the Army when he turned 18, went to Vietnam, came back broken." Catherine felt reality restructuring itself around her. "You knew? When David Henderson was killed, you knew he was your grandson?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I'd been watching David from a distance for years. Following his social work career, so proud of the man he'd become, I never approached him because I thought it would be selfish to disrupt his life just to satisfy an old woman's regrets." The implications crashed down on Catherine like an avalanche. "The night Bobby killed David and Maria and Sophie, you lost your grandson and great-granddaughter. And I said nothing," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I knew Bobby Morrison was dangerous behind the wheel. I'd seen him stumble and drunk dozens of times, heard his car scraping against the garage walls, but I needed my job with your family, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere." Catherine felt nauseated. The scope of her family's failure was beyond anything she'd imagined. Ruth hadn't just failed to report a dangerous driver. She'd failed to protect her own grandson. "There's more," Ruth continued, her voice growing weaker. "About the money, about why I let you take it. Nana, you need to rest." "Listen to me," Ruth insisted. "I've been putting money aside for 30 years, saving every penny I could. Not for my care, not for comfort. I was saving it for David's children, for Frank's grandchildren. I wanted to help them with college, with opportunities I never had." Catherine felt her heart breaking in entirely new ways. "But Sophie died. David never had other children." "No, but Frank has been working with homeless veterans since he got clean, helping young men who remind him of David, trying to save them the way he couldn't save his own boy. I've been anonymously funding his work through a nonprofit account." Ruth reached under her pillow with shaking hands and withdrew a folded document. "This is my real will, Kathy, the one I had my lawyer draw up last month when I knew I was dying." Catherine unfolded the papers with trembling fingers. The legal language was complex, but the essential points were clear. Ruth Walsh was leaving her entire estate, nearly $2 million, to the Henderson Memorial Foundation, with Frank Rodriguez as the primary administrator and Catherine Morrison as co-trustee, contingent upon her completion of community service related to elder care advocacy. "I don't understand," Catherine whispered. "I'm giving you a chance to make things right," Ruth explained, "not through punishment, but through purpose. The foundation will fund programs for homeless veterans, elder abuse prevention, and medical care for underserved communities. All the ways our family failed the Hendersons, you can help other families succeed." Catherine stared at the document, overwhelmed by the complexity of her grandmother's plan. "But I'm going to prison. I can't administer a foundation from federal custody." Ruth smiled weakly. "Your lawyer is very good, sweetheart." With Frank's victim impact testimony and this foundation proposal, he thinks he can negotiate a plea deal, reduced sentence, early release for community service. "You'd work directly with Frank to build something meaningful from all this tragedy." "Why?" Catherine asked desperately. "Why would you trust me with this after everything I've done?" Ruth's grip on Catherine's hand tightened. "Because you're not the worst thing you've ever done, Kathy. You're a good person who made terrible choices when you were scared and overwhelmed. But good people can learn from their mistakes and choose differently." The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of medical equipment. Catherine felt the weight of forgiveness and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. "What about Danny?" Catherine asked. "Dr. O'Sullivan." Ruth's eyes brightened slightly. "Ah, yes, the young doctor who's been carrying guilt that isn't his to carry." Maria Henderson's lupus was misdiagnosed by multiple physicians over several months. Daniel was the last in a chain of medical failures, not the cause of them. The foundation will fund better diagnostic training for primary care physicians, but Daniel himself deserves forgiveness, not punishment. "I think I love him," Catherine admitted quietly. "I know you do," Ruth smiled. "And I think he loves you too. Love built on shared guilt isn't sustainable, but love built on shared purpose to do better, that can last a lifetime." Deputy Martinez stepped quietly into the room. "Miss Morrison, we need to head back soon." Catherine turned back to her grandmother, desperate to memorize every detail of Ruth's face. "I don't know how to do this, Nana. I don't know how to be the person you think I can become." Ruth's voice was growing fainter, but her words were clear. "Start by forgiving yourself, darling. Then spend the rest of your life earning the forgiveness of others through service. It's not about being perfect. It's about being useful." As Catherine kissed her grandmother's forehead goodbye, Ruth whispered one final truth that would sustain her through the difficult years ahead. "Remember, sweetheart, redemption isn't a destination you reach. It's a direction you choose to walk, one step at a time, for the rest of your life." Ruth Walsh died peacefully 4 hours later, surrounded by nurses who'd grown to love the fierce old woman with the surprising moments of clarity. By the time Catherine returned to her jail cell, she was no longer just a disgraced executive awaiting sentencing. She was the co-trustee of a foundation that could transform her family's legacy from one of selfish destruction to purposeful healing. But first, she had to learn how to forgive herself enough to believe she deserved a second chance. 2 years later, Catherine Morrison stood in the sunlit community garden behind the Henderson Memorial Community Center, watching Danny O'Sullivan teach a group of homeless veterans how to plant tomatoes. The October afternoon was crisp and golden, Philadelphia's autumn painting the sky in shades of hope that seemed impossible during the darkest days of their shared ordeal. Danny's medical license had been restored 6 months earlier after extensive review by the state board and completion of additional training in lupus diagnosis and treatment. He now served as the volunteer medical director for 3 free clinics funded by the Henderson Memorial Foundation, providing care to patients who couldn't afford traditional health care. His hair had more gray than when Catherine first met him, but his eyes carried a peace she'd never seen during their early days of shared guilt and desperate attraction. "Dad, you're doing it wrong!" Mickey O'Sullivan called out, laughing as his father struggled with a particularly stubborn tomato plant. At 20, Mickey had grown into a confident young man studying social work at Temple University, his childhood anger transformed into passionate advocacy for systemic change. He spent his weekends volunteering at the center, working with teenagers who reminded Catherine of herself at that age, angry, scared, and convinced the world was fundamentally unfair. Frank Rodriguez approached the garden carrying a watering can, his weathered face creased in a smile that had taken months to develop. The 84-year-old Vietnam veteran had thrown himself into the foundation's work with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. His programs for homeless veterans had already placed over 200 men and women in stable housing, and his monthly support groups had become legendary in Philadelphia's recovery community. "How'd the board meeting go?" Frank asked Catherine, settling onto a wooden bench that had been donated by one of Bobby's former business associates, a man seeking his own form of redemption through charitable giving. "Better than expected," Catherine replied, sitting beside him. "The city approved our proposal for the transitional housing complex, 60 units, with wraparound services and a requirement that residents contribute to community programs based on their abilities rather than their income." The transitional housing project represented everything Catherine had learned about dignity and reciprocity during her 18 months in federal prison. Rather than treating residents as charity cases, the complex would operate as a working community where people contributed their skills, cooking, maintenance, childcare, tutoring, in exchange for stable housing while they rebuilt their lives. Catherine's own path to this moment had been neither straight nor simple. Her plea agreement had resulted in an 18-month federal sentence followed by 3 years of supervised release with mandatory community service. She'd served her time at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, where she'd taught financial literacy classes to other inmates and learned more about resilience from women who'd survived circumstances that made her privileged struggles seem almost quaint. Prison had stripped away everything Catherine thought she needed: designer clothes, expensive cars, the rush of closing million-dollar construction deals. What remained was the core of who she'd always been beneath the layers of corporate armor. Someone who wanted to build things that mattered, who found purpose in solving problems that improve people's lives. Bobby had received a 15-year sentence for vehicular homicide and obstruction of justice, but he was already eligible for parole review thanks to his exemplary behavior and participation in victim impact programs. He'd completed addiction treatment, earned his GED, and was working toward a bachelor's degree in addiction counseling through the prison's education program. His letters to Catherine were filled with genuine remorse and detailed plans for how he wanted to spend the rest of his life making amends to the families his drinking had destroyed. The most surprising transformation had been Frank's relationship with Bobby. The old veteran had begun visiting his son's killer in prison 6 months into Bobby's sentence, initially driven by anger and a need for answers. Those visits had evolved into something resembling friendship, built on their shared understanding of how guilt could either destroy a person or motivate them toward service. "He's not the same kid who killed my family," Frank had told Catherine during one of their weekly foundation meetings. "Prison broke him down and built him back up into someone who might actually do some good in the world. I can't bring back David and Maria and Sophie, but I can help Bobby become the kind of man who prevents other families from going through what we've endured." As the afternoon grew later, the community center filled with its usual evening activities. In the main gymnasium, a group of single mothers attended a financial planning workshop, while their children played in the adjacent childcare room. The computer lab buzzed with job seekers updating resumes and adults taking GED preparation classes. The medical clinic Danny operated saw a steady stream of patients who couldn't afford traditional health care but received dignity and respect along with treatment for their ailments. Catherine found herself in the memorial room where Ruth's portrait hung beside photographs of David, Maria, and Sophie Henderson. The display also included images from the Foundation's various programs: veterans receiving housing vouchers, elderly residents of nursing homes participating in advocacy training, medical students learning about lupus diagnosis through Danny's expanded curriculum. Danny appeared beside her, still wearing his gardening gloves and carrying the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day doing meaningful work. "Mickey's driving Frank home," he said, settling his hand gently on Catherine's lower back. "Thought we might grab dinner somewhere quiet." Catherine leaned into his touch, marveling at how natural their relationship had become once it was built on shared purpose rather than mutual guilt. They'd married 6 months earlier in a simple ceremony at the community center, with Frank walking Catherine down the aisle and Mickey serving as Danny's best man. Bobby had called from prison that morning to offer his blessing and congratulations, his voice thick with emotion as he told his sister how proud he was of the woman she'd become. "There's something I want to show you first," Catherine said, leading Danny to her office on the second floor. The space was modest compared to her former executive suite at Morrison Construction, but it reflected who she'd become rather than who she'd been trying to appear. The walls were covered with thank you letters from Foundation beneficiaries, photos from community events, and a framed copy of Ruth's final letter, the one that had outlined her vision for transforming the Morrison family legacy. Catherine opened her desk drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was Ruth's engagement ring, the modest diamond that had represented love during the Great Depression when such luxuries were rare and precious. "Frank brought this to me yesterday," Catherine explained. "He said Ruth always intended for me to have it, but she wanted me to earn it by becoming someone worthy of wearing it." Danny's eyes grew soft with understanding. "What do you think? Have you earned it?" Catherine looked out the window at the community garden where homeless veterans were learning to grow food, at the parking lot where people arrived each day seeking second chances, at the memorial wall where 3 innocent lives were honored through service rather than mourned in futility. "I think," she said slowly, "I've learned that earning redemption isn't about reaching some finish line where you're finally good enough. It's about choosing every day to be useful, to be kind, to build something beautiful from whatever wreckage you've been given to work with." Danny kissed her gently, tasting hope and tomatoes and the promise of many more years spent building something meaningful together. Outside, Philadelphia settled into evening, a city full of second chances and people brave enough to take them. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness creates the biggest miracles. When Daniel offered his jacket to a shivering stranger at a Philadelphia bus stop, he had no idea he was about to change both their lives forever. This isn't just a story about love. It's about the power of second chances, the strength found in admitting our mistakes, and the beautiful truth that redemption is always possible, no matter how far we've fallen. At 55, 60, or 68, many of us carry regrets that feel too heavy to bear. We've made choices we wish we could undo, hurt people we love, or lost opportunities that seemed like our last chance at happiness. But Daniel and Catherine's journey proves that it's never too late to rebuild, to forgive ourselves, and to discover that our greatest failures can become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions. Their story reminds us that wisdom comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from having the courage to face them honestly and choose service over self-pity. True happiness isn't found in perfection. It's discovered in purpose, in community, and in the daily choice to be useful to others. What mistake from your past taught you the most valuable lesson? Have you ever experienced unexpected kindness from a stranger that changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.